My position is the founder of 4Quant, lecturer at ETH Zurich, and a researcher at the Paul Scherrer Institute. And so what I'll talk today about is sort of this interactive scientific image analysis and analytics using Spark, and we'll have a couple different examples from that. So the first is sort of the background we have, which is our technique, which is what gave us big data in the first place and why we needed to switch away from kind of the standard tools towards something more like Spark. Then I'll talk a little bit about the imaging world in 2015 and how that's shifting towards these much bigger scale problems that require new kinds of solutions. I'll then briefly talk about the different tools we have, and then the science that can actually be done with this, or the sort of projects we can analyze using these tools. So synchrotron-based X-ray tomographic microscopy is quite a mouthful, but it's a very powerful technique that lets you peer inside large samples and get very good spatial and temporal resolution. And so we can get submicron imaging with more than 10 hertz, which means you can get a full 3D image 10 times a second and see things like flowing bubbles in this example, where you can actually see the flow moving, or a volcano being heated by a laser system and actually watch the air evolve in a system like that. And of course, the major problem with this is when it's running at full speed, you end up with 8 gigabytes a second of images, which is more data if you were to measure it 24 hours a day than Facebook or Instagram collect. And so that's a huge amount of data to try to process, particularly when we're all physicists and have no idea how to handle big data problems. So now, looking at image science in general in 2015, that we're really not the only ones with this issue, that we look at sort of diffraction groups, and they're moving up to 30 gigabytes a second. Lots of other beamlines are getting terabytes of data a day. In optical microscopy, as Jeremy presented earlier, they get 500 megabytes a second, and maybe even faster now. And even standard measurements are getting up to 75 megabytes a second, which is already quite fast. When we look at geospatial, which there was a presentation in the other room about, new satellite projects are acquiring lots and lots of images, and they'll produce hundreds of terabytes to petabytes a year of images that need to be processed. And even in your own home, so the new GoPro Black can produce 60 megabytes a second of data. And so to analyze that, extract useful metrics, and do something useful is challenging. And so what we've seen basically is that the breakdown for experiments and analyses that you do has shifted from this kind of even balance in 2000 to a really out of whack balance in 2010, 14, and beyond, where you spend much more time trying to figure out the analysis than the experiment. So I think this is quite helpful for understanding what a terabyte is really. And so in imaging science, if you were to look at one of these 1,000 by 1,000 images every second, it would take you 139 hours to look at the entire data set. And so for doing analyses on it, I mean, when 1 second you couldn't even count the number of black spots, let alone trying to figure out anything else about the data. And so the major change that we've seen with this is that in 2000, it took us 4,000 minutes to measure a terabyte of data. And today, we can do that in 2 minutes. And so if you wanted to keep up with that rate, you'd need 4,000 people looking at these images all the time. And you'd need to spend 50,000 a month. Maybe it'd be cheaper here, but in Switzerland, salaries are quite expensive. So it's a major problem. Furthermore, as I guess many of you are aware, computing has changed in general. And so computers have doubled in transistors, but their absolute speed has not really increased recently. And so it's important to be able to divide up and have parallel code, which makes everything more complicated and more difficult to manage. Furthermore, the costs of doing this computation have gone down, and the cost and the ability to sort of access cloud machines and perform all the analysis there has gotten much, much easier. And so unless you use a computer every minute of every day, it's really not worth it to have your own systems. It's much easier to just throw it out on the cloud, perform the analysis when you need it, and then return the computers when you're done. So really the problems that we have is there's kind of a flood of new data. And so what took an entire PhD 3 or 4 years ago can now be done in a couple seconds. And so you need a new approach to keep up with this data so that you can do something useful with it. sort of the optimized data structures and the single core computing that we've been using up until now really aren't going to handle the new kinds of problems we have and are going to make coding and analyzing these data sets really difficult. So now this is probably quite debatable depending on where you come from, but these were the priorities we came up with for the problems we were trying to solve. And so of course the first priority for us is correctness. And so if you write an image processing algorithm and it gives you a wrong result, it doesn't matter how fast it is or how easy it is, it's useless. And so it needs to be correct, and it needs to be easy to ensure that it's correct. The second is really this understood and changeable code. And that means that you don't have huge code bases that spend the entire time dealing with memory allocation. You really focus on what your problem at hand is. The last priority here is really fast, and that incorporates both speed and the amount of time you have to spend developing it and working on it. And so here it's important to be able to get results very quickly and to be able to implement and test new ideas. So what we decided to do is rather than use existing image processing tools, we picked the framework first, and that was Apache Spark and Hadoop, because that allows us to scale out to the problems and the size that we'll have and handle sort of this fault tolerance and storing and processing huge amounts of data, even though it doesn't have anything built in it for imaging. So we had to develop all of that from scratch. So this is really the problem you have when you use Spark, is that you have all these neat commands like flat map, filter, aggregate, join, group by, but those don't sound like anything you would want to do to an image. What you want to do to an image is filter out noise, segment, maybe locate a region of interest, contour, kind of other tasks like that. And so what we developed is this Spark image layer, which allows you to kind of speak the image language you're used to and have that translated to then Spark commands underneath so that you can do all the processing you want to do without worrying about how the images are actually stored or where the partitions go or how the map and reduce structures work. So these are sort of the processing and analysis tools we've developed already. And to kind of put this in the Spark ecosystem, as some of the slides earlier today showed, the image layer is kind of all of these components. And so on the very bottom, it allows you to interact with image type data sources, whether they be from image files themselves or sort of a database server that has all your images. And then this imaging layer where all the analysis we have is built on top of it. And so we have image processing, analysis, integrated visualizations and previews, and then finally this kind of workflow creation so that you don't have to make everything in Scala and you can have a quite easy to view tool that I'll talk about later. So looking at some of the use cases for this, so hyperspectral imaging is becoming ever more popular, and that's where instead of having a single intensity at your point, or maybe a red, green, and blue color, you have a whole spectrum. And so this is an example looking at adipocytes and the Raman spectra that they have at each point. And so these red dots are shown here as little spectra, and you'd like to be able to process them as images. And so what Spark or Scala has with this with this statically typed interface and a lot of the tools that are available in Scala is the ability to implement a lot of these functions for generic typed images that you then don't have to program a lot later. And so you can say something like filtering noise means combining information from nearby pixels in order to reduce the noise level, and finding objects means determining groups of pixels which are similar to the desired result. And that means you don't have to specifically say for a type double image you do this. You simply say what this behavior is. You then can, this is the only slide I think with all code, but you then can define sort of these traits, and if you've implemented all of these functions for whatever type you're looking at, you can then perform simple filters or component labeling or any other task, and you don't care what your image is stored as underneath. You just care that that's been implemented for it. And so it means if you spent a lot of time making interesting filters or anisotropic diffusion filters and things like this, that you don't have to rewrite it again when you end up with a hyperspectral image. You can just use it as it is, and it works as expected. Boom. So for interactive analysis, we've developed a number of little visualizations, and you can go look at these on your own. But basically, this plugs in. Rather than having a separate tool, we integrate it into the web GUI that Spark has already, because it's all quite nice and easy to extend. And so you can see here you have sort of the descendancy of all the RDDs that you're using, so you can see how they were constructed. And then you can get a live preview of what's actually inside it. Then I think we can go. Yeah, if it contains sort of numeric information, you can get sort of these live graphs that show what's basically in that data. And this isn't, of course, meant to compete with any of these other visualization tools. It's just supposed to make your analysis job much easier, because you don't have to export your data and plot it every time you're trying to do something. You can just quickly go and preview it in the browser. And this just integrates as part of the standard Spark interface. And so it's not anything extra. It's just a layer on top. And yeah, you can watch the rest of that movie on the website, and I think it's on YouTube as well if you're interested. So now looking at the scientific cases, so one of the projects we did was genome-scale imaging, where you're trying to understand the link between the genotype or the genetic background and the structures inside of it. And there have been studies before, but they're really small, very time-consuming, and not really flexible or reproducible. And so when you look at projects of this scale, it's quite important to have lots of samples. And so this is kind of the results you get with 700, and this is the result with 1200. And from that, it's pretty clear that you wouldn't have any signal from your data. With only 700, you really need to get up to 1200 or beyond to get a useful result. And if we look at how this was done in 2008 with sort of hand approaches, it would take 120 years to do a study of this scale. If we look at kind of a more modern 2014 approach, you have sort of 5 or 6 different tools that are all hacked together, and it takes about 1.5 years of sort of dedicated student time, which is shorter, of course, than 120 years, but still a fairly serious project. We now look at what you can do with Spark Imaging Layer, and you have now kind of one command or one set of analyses that handle all of your data at the same time and distribute it over the cluster and perform all of the analysis, so that you can focus on what's interesting in your results rather than focusing on how you link 10 different tools together. And so here you can do sort of component labeling and export your results. You can also do the statistical analysis later by just opening it up, particularly with these tools like Spark CSV, and just import it, combine it with the image data, and do all sorts of other analyses with it. Another sort of example problem that we have is this full brain imaging. And so the goal here is to measure a full mouse brain, which is 1 cubic centimeter, at 1 micron resolution. And so this is 14 teravoxels of data. And this image here shows that percentage of the entire data set. And so it's a huge amount of data to analyze, and to even load that up on one machine is impossible. So there's no computers that you can do that with. And so the first problem you have is that you've done all these measurements and you want to combine them together. And how do you go about stitching? And so traditionally, that's a rather complicated problem. But if you do this in Spark and you have this imaging layer on top, you have a quite easy infrastructure. So you basically just find the overlapping images and run cross-correlation and then let it go. And if you have 2 computers, it will take a really long time. And if you have 1,000 computers, it will be done very quickly. You can then use that to come up with a sort of stitching of your final image once you've figured out where each tile goes. And then you can render the pieces of the image you're interested in real time, sort of lazily. So you don't actually change your underlying data. You just render what you're interested in seeing. So yeah, if you want that part of the image, it just grabs the 4 tiles that are relevant and renders that part. It doesn't actually store any of these things. And so your data remains very live. So here's another example where we look at sort of real-time imaging with Spark streaming. And so we have tools that integrate into ImageJ and Fiji that allow you to use the tools that have been developed for that already on your image tasks. And what it allows you to do is make things like streaming analysis and have very simple commands. And so you load your images, you run a median filter, you then combine them together and divide it by the total number of images, which is pretty clear, just creating an average image, and then maybe you look for outliers by averages that are far above what the result should be. You then can watch the demo. This, I don't trust myself to do a live demo, but you can see here on YouTube and watch it yourself later and see that you get these live results from just one machine. And of course, you could easily distribute it on a cluster and solve much more complicated problems, but it keeps your general coding very simple, where you don't have to worry about what image type is being transported or how big the data is. You can just run it. So now, as a scientist, and not a data scientist, because this was made, this distinction was made before, that, you know, Spark is a really cool tool, and Scala is a beautiful but not necessarily easy language. Python's an easier language, but you still have this problem of non-obvious workflows, and you can have scripts depending on scripts depending on scripts, which means if someone changes one of them, everything can break, and you don't really know why. And so while all these analyses are ultimately a workflow where things are connected together, it's very difficult for non-technical persons to see how this workflow fits together. And so one of the things we're developing is called little blocks for big data, which allows you to use a tool called KNIME to basically make your Spark workflow and combine all the different components you have so that someone else can open and get this view and then change the parameters of the analysis without having to know any Scala or Python or other tools. And then you don't end up with code like this that someone has to figure out what it means. You just have a bunch of different labeled blocks. And what's really nice about these tools is that it adds no overhead to your Spark interface. And so this runs as then a standard Spark workflow without any loading of additional KNIME libraries or things like that. And so all of your data stays in this fast form and can be computed quickly with Spark, and you have all the benefits of the Spark ecosystem. You just have the niceness of being able to use simple blocks rather than being forced to have Scala code that you compile or notebooks. So in terms of a reality check, a lot of the stuff we mentioned will not be nearly as performant as optimized CPU or GPU code, but it's much easier to program. Human time is 400 times more expensive than AWS time for sort of the base instance. Mistakes due to poor testing, if you're implementing very specific algorithms, can be fatal. It makes your data useless. And you know, when you're dealing with really large data sets, they won't fit in GPU memory or local CPU memory. And so you spend a lot of time dealing with the logistics of loading data in and out and making sure the edges overlap, which isn't really related to your problem at all. It's more of a implementation detail. So we have a cool tool. What does it mean for you? So we have a spin-off that's been formed, 4Quant, that has some of these tools available where we do the analysis for you or develop new analysis tools. And then we do consulting and education for how you can use Spark for image processing type problems and how you can use the image layer we've developed for your tool or as part of your workflows. So I'd like to acknowledge the IT department at Paul Scherrer Institute and scientific computing at ETH, and then the X-ray microscopy research group. And of course, we're interested in partnerships and collaborations, and you for your attention. So.
So I've seen sort of attempts to move some of the textual-based big data, not Spark, but the old Hive, you know, Cumulo, HBase type systems that were developed for text into images. And there seems to always be a decision point that has to happen early on, whether you're going to do really big images like medical and astronomy data, or you're going to do a lot of really small images. And when you make that choice, the system design goes one of two dramatically different directions, and you can't really go back. Did you find that to be true when using Spark, or does this system work just as well on lots of little images and a few big images?
So of course, if you're trying to get the best performance out of your system, then focusing on either big images or little images will probably give you better performance, because of course if you have little images you can do everything on the CPU, and if you have big images then you need to think about how you divide it up and everything else. But what we've tried to do is make it for big images but also handle lots of little images as well. And maybe you don't have the best performance for little images, but it lets you use the same code base on everything, which makes your problem much easier to sort of deal with. And so particularly with the ImageJ integration we have, you can use any of those tools on small images, and so a lot of the things have already been developed there and don't need to be developed again. And then for big images, you kind of make your own tools for figuring out what to do with them. But yeah, we found we can kind of go both paths without losing out too much in either area.
you showed that it would take hundreds of years in 2008, and in 2014 it would take 1.5 years. I assume that's with a Hadoop implementation?
No, that's with sort of the standard cluster setup that with Oracle Grid Engine.
Okay.
On top with all these other tools connected together.
Okay, and then what does it take now using Spark?
So now, of course, the bottleneck with imaging data is getting it to the cluster. And so once the data is there, it's as many nodes as you have. So you can have the whole analysis done in 12 hours if you have enough nodes running in parallel. But for uploading it to Amazon so that you have as many nodes as possible, it takes you 36 hours to upload all of the data from your site to their site. And so that's then really the limiting factor you have.
Okay.
And hopefully that will get better. But right now, that's the major issue, that if you measure it 8 gigabytes a second, even if you could, in theory, analyze that much on Amazon, your pipe to them is 150 megabytes a second. And so that's an order of magnitude difference that you kind of have to deal with somehow.
I guess then it's about co-location wherever Amazon is to minimize that time.
Or having big computational resources locally.
Right.
Ship them a drive. FedEx.
I don't need to just typically how many nodes in the cluster are we talking about when you say, 36 hours or whatever, 8 hours of processing?
So with the genetic task, that can be as many nodes as you want because each item is independent. I mean, you're analyzing 2,000 or 1,300 completely independent images. And so there that you don't have any synchronization issues or data being sent back and forth, and so the scale of the cluster can really go up as much as you want. Of course, when you're dealing with really large images and you have much more overlap and much more data that needs to be sent back and forth between sort of iterations, that will get much slower. And there we've dealt with clusters with sort of 100 nodes, and it seems to still be increasing and you're still benefiting. But if you go significantly beyond that, it can then be more of a problem. It also depends on how you store your data. And so if you store it on one high-speed file system and you have 100 nodes trying to read from that file system at the same time, you'll have a bottleneck there. And if you use HDFS, then you can sort of read out in parallel and not be slowed down by that aspect.
One last question.
Could you comment, given the technologies you mentioned, could you comment on reconstruction?
Reconstruction.
Yes.
So my job hasn't been doing reconstruction problems at all. It would fit well with reconstruction, but we have sort of an existing workflow for that. And what we would develop in Spark would be more flexible, but less performant. And so for a problem where you don't need flexibility, these tools might not be the right answer. And so if you've already developed something and it works really performant, the likelihood you can re-implement it in Spark and have it be faster, I would say is not very high for these kind of problems.